So in this first video exploring the Revolution and Dictatorship module for AQA A-level history, what I want to do is think about the state of Russia in 1917. Think about what Russia was doing, the kinds of economic situations it was in, the social landscape, as well as the political dynamics and the evidence of the political dynamics, of course, as we sort of go into 1917. So we're talking specifically not necessarily about the entire year of 1917. Of course, we're going to be spending a good 30 or so lessons exploring the entire year of 1917, given that this is obviously the year of the February and October revolutions. So we'll just talk about the political and social landscape of the Russian Empire at this point, and think about the context in which we are going to be thinking about the revolutions. So why did the revolutions happen? How did the revolutions happen? In order to know some of these features, we have to think about the historical context, of course. So beginning first then, when we think about social landscape, it should be noted that the majority of the Russian population, roughly 80%, of the entire population of the Russian Empire, were peasants. They were part of the peasantry class, often still tied in one way or another to land, and resentful of the inequalities, despite the fact that, of course, as early as 1861, we see the emancipation of the serfs. Essentially, what existed prior to 1861 is a form of slavery, sometimes known as serfdom, where an individual is tied to, legally tied to, the land in which they operate and in which they work, that is obviously owned by some kind of wealthier landowner. Now, while the emancipation of the serfs took place all the way back in 1861, it took place under the reign of Alexander II, the Tsar Alexander II, we still have a lot of poverty in the Russian Empire. Roughly 80% of the population are impoverished. They endured some burdensome redemption payments, which was part of the sort of emancipation process, and often reverted to subsistence farming amid some of the issues that we start to see taking place in 1917. It should be noted that, of course, as early as 1914, the Russian Empire has been engaged in World War. It's been engaged in World War I against the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, and this hasn't gone particularly well for the Russian Empire. Okay, they had some very minor successes at the beginning, and then have taken quite a lot of failures and taken on quite a lot of issues associated with this conflict. And so one of the things that we have to think about is the relationship between the social and the economic. The subsistence farming was something that became a priority for many of the peasantry class because of the rise in inflation as the result of the wartime disruptions. So the economic conditions, which we'll get to later on in this lesson, starts to inform and starts to shape the ways in which a number of members of the peasantry class would be able to operate. When it comes to the urban workforce, so the people who live in the cities, rapid industrialization had produced a concentrated, quite disgruntled working class. Factory life was quite harsh and involved quite a lot of long hours, up to 12 hours a day. Unsafe conditions, crowded tenement housing. Often we see, for example, as many as 6 people per room in places like Petrograd, for example. Workers would face inadequate wages and were also exposed to, as the result of this deep concentration of workforce, they were exposed to revolutionary ideas, which heightened their expectations. So revolutionary ideas is an issue that is is a sort of an issue for the Tsar, at least, that is permeating throughout a lot of this social landscape. The society at large was politically energized, becoming politically energized, and the worsening of the sort of material conditions of these individuals would, of course, increase the ability for them to become politically energized. Workers, peasants, the growth of a middle class, women, soldiers, and national minorities all formed representatives. So you have, for example, factory committees, you have soldiers' councils, sometimes described as soviets. The sort of the ideas of workers and soldiers' councils were sort of described as soviets. They would then begin to voice demands for things like land rights and for autonomy, and also for an ending of the First World War, which is, of course, one of the major conditions that is causing a lot of this disruption economically and politically. Speaking of economic disruptions, the main issue that we are thinking about during this time period is, of course, inflation. War financing would take place through the printing of more money, essentially. The printing of the ruble and a greater amount of ruble printing would trigger a runaway inflation. Essentially, inflation, for those of you who aren't studying economics or haven't studied economics at A-level or GCSE, is this idea of the value of currency decreasing. Essentially, alternatively, you can define inflation as the value of goods increasing, but ultimately it results in the same idea. That's all you need to really know. Essentially, if you print more money, the value of each individual bits of that money gets less and less because there's more of it in circulation, and this can cause runaway inflation. It can cause the living costs outpacing the wages that are being given. So if, for example, workers are given a certain amount of wages, but the costs of all those goods are increasing because of inflation, it means that it won't be very long before they are unable to actually be able to afford any of the things that they need. So, for example, some useful statistics for you here is that salt prices by 1917 had risen as high as 483%, whereas wages had only gone up by a percentage of 133%, and meat had gone as high as 232%. So the wages of workers were not keeping up with the price inflation of these items, which meant that there would be difficulty for ordinary people, ordinary workers, to be able to afford any of the basic things like salt and meat and bread and all these different kinds of things. In addition to this, for example, we see that food supplies are also plummeting. The supply of that food at the same time is beginning to drop because of the war effort, which further increases its value and therefore further increases its price. Because if you have less of a thing, that thing becomes more valuable if the demand, assuming demand stays the same. We see, for example, things like railways collapsing, workers flocking to jobs offering rations, and peasants are starting to hoard grain in 1917. The war and the mismanagement of the war led factory closures. It led to soaring urban unemployment. It led to shortages of fuel and the breakdown of transportation networks. The result is that essentially by late 1917, at least, the economy was in freefall. We'll get to late 1917 later on, but at least as early as in early 1917, we see these problems become major issues for which revolution is going to be one of the major developments. And so really, as a sort of summary of what the year of 1917 is going to bring for the Russian Empire and the Russian people, we have, at the beginning at least, the autocracy of the Russian Tsar. The Russian Tsar being a translation of a Russification of the word Caesar, as sort of the king of Russia, essentially, was Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II. And it was an autocratic monarchy. He controlled monarchy. He controlled the government. He had a great amount of control over all aspects of the Russian Empire's government control. And he was part of what is known as the Romanov dynasty, a line of succession that dates all the way back to 1613 with the reign of Mikhail I. Prior to that, you had the Rurikid dynasty, which ended with the reign of Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV. There was a sort of period in between Ivan and Mikhail, which was a period known as the Time of Troubles, where a lot of people died and a lot of people tried to become Tsar and tried to become king and all this kind of thing. And then the Russian parliament of the 1600s, sometimes known as the Zemsky Sobor, essentially elected Mikhail I in 1613 to become the new Tsar of Russia. And this set a course of motion of 3 centuries of Romanov rule that ends in 1917 with Tsar Nicholas II. And it ends because mainly the First World War. The First World War is raging. The First World War is not going very well for the Russian Empire, and it is causing political, social, and economic collapse across all aspects of Russian society. It ultimately leads to his abdication. The abdication of the Tsar takes place on the 23rd of February, or at least the revolution that begins the abdication takes place on the 23rd of February, and we'll get to that in future lessons' time. But what ultimately happens is, following the February Revolution, you have a period of dual authority, where you have the dual authority of both the provisional government, and the power sharing of that of the Petrograd Soviet. And we will get to that in future lessons. We'll talk about the provisional government. We'll talk about the Petrograd Soviet. We'll talk about the failures of the provisional government during the February Revolution, during the rest of February, which then leads to the October Revolution, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and the establishment of the communist takeover, the communist dictatorship that begins in the end of 1917 and up to 1918. So as a general overview then, we can see that we are talking about a very unequal society. There are social disparities. 80% of the population are part of the peasantry class. There is a lot of urban overcrowding, lots of poor working conditions. Economic statistics, we have the salt prices going up 483%, wages staying at only 133%, meat as high as 232% in terms of their value. The political breakdown leads to a dual power structure with the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet, and we also see a decentralization of the military at the same time. And then from here we see the development from February through to October, the seizure of control by the Bolshevik Party and the establishment of the communist state and the communist party's dominance over the Russian territory, which establishes the Soviet Union.